Alright guys, last video lecture on the Civil War coming at you in a second, okay? Again, make sure you're getting your DBQs done. We're going to wrap up the Civil War unit in a moment, and then we will move on to post-Civil War stuff, which is Reconstruction, and basically the last unit of the year after this. So enjoy this lecture. I'm sure you will. And then we will discuss some other things, okay? So, we left off with the actual fighting of the Civil War, surrender at Appomattox Courthouse between Grant and Lee, and Lincoln trying to kind of ease things out, right? Because he knows he's got to put the country back together. We're going to talk a little bit about the actual political part of this, and what played out because of that. So, in the middle of the whole mess, Lincoln realizes he's got to do something to try and gain an advantage for the Union, for the North. Okay? So, as we get towards the end of the war, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the slaves. But here's the tricky part. Lincoln is a very sly political guy. He knows what he's doing. So he frees slaves only in rebelling states. Okay? This will help with that DBQ you guys are doing. Is Lincoln the great emancipator or freer of slaves? He frees the slaves only in rebelling states. Why? Well, those are the southern states for the most part, and he's hoping to cause slave rebellions or ex-slave rebellions in the South. The idea is that if they are so busy dealing with that, they won't have time to deal with the war itself, right? He does not free slaves in non-rebelling states, so the border states and the northern states, he doesn't free them there, just the rebelling states. Okay, Lincoln's got some issues he's got to figure out at the end of this war. That's one of them. What do we do with slavery? He's going to push for the 13th Amendment, which will abolish slavery. It passes. It's close, but it passes. We'll talk a little bit more about that next unit. There's a great movie called Lincoln. We would watch that if we were in class, about basically that process and why it's such a big deal to get that passed to free the slaves throughout the entire country. So yes, he eventually does get the 13th Amendment passed, but that is not his initial or original intent. Okay. His other question is, what do we do with these border states? I mean, they were allowed to keep their slaves. Do we now say, hey, welcome back to the Union, get rid of your slaves? So Lincoln's got to figure that concept out as well. Some other things that come out of the end of the Civil War, there's a lot of political change because of the Civil War. How politics is dealt with, how politics is handled. Remember, when the South didn't get what it wanted, when the Confederacy didn't get what it wanted, it, prior to this, always threatened secession, right? It always threatened to leave the Union, to break off, to become its own country. Well, the government decides it's got to do something about that, right? So there's no longer a threat of secession after the Civil War. The central government becomes too strong, too powerful, and it basically just makes it illegal. It outlaws the ability to secede and become your own country, all right? And again, that's because of increased federal power. The government from the Civil War gives itself a mass amount of power. We're seeing a lot of that today, right? How the central government has power in some aspects over the states, and that comes out of this whole issue that arises during the Civil War. All right. Another big issue that comes out of the Civil War is the massive economic and educational divide between the North and the South. The North booms. It becomes incredibly wealthy due to technology, production during the Civil War, all sorts of things like that. The South is destroyed. All right. Farms are destroyed. Livestock was killed. Farms were not tilled. They were not turned over. So the crops die. People lose their jobs. They lose their livelihood. Education had continued in the North during all of this. It had come to an abrupt stop in the South. So there becomes a massive gap in who has what, haves and have-nots between the North and the South, and the level of education, the level of kind of intelligence, if you will. It becomes an education gap as well. All right. So again, the economy in the North booms, South absolutely devastated. Their industry is destroyed, farms are destroyed, like we said. But one of the big things is they lose slavery. So that whole King Cotton situation, what are we going to do without it, right? What are we going to do without slave labor in the South? And that becomes a big kind of ethical and political question. The Civil War is the first of what we call the modern wars, and that's because a lot of weaponry was created for use in the Civil War. It wasn't necessarily just a use what you had. A lot of things were created, new types of rifles, new types of guns, the Gatling gun, which is your pre-machine gun, able to fire off a lot of ammunition at one time. We get different kinds of mines. We get the first rudimentary grenades, the use of barbed wire in wars, the use of trenches in wars, and the world really pays attention to this. And unfortunately, you see this happen in most wars from this point on out. People who are, or countries who are creating weaponry specifically for that war. When you get to American II, you'll see that a lot in World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, etc. All right? So the style of war in general just kind of flat out changes. How wars are fought, how they're dealt with, how people go about, kind of succeeding in battle or in war is changed by the world paying attention to what happens in the Civil War. So Lincoln's got a lot to worry about. He's got a lot to figure out. How is he going to put this country back together, right? How are things going to get made stable again? But unfortunately, he never gets a chance to do that. We don't know how it would have been done. We don't know how he would have gone about it. But he unfortunately meets his end. He is assassinated in Ford's Theater, right? So the Civil War's come to an end. His wife convinces him they need some time to relax, to kind of go back to normal. So he decides to go see a play about the creation of America, how great America is, in Ford's Theater. Okay, he is assassinated by a Southern, a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. There's a lot of very interesting history behind this. If you are ever really curious, you can look. John Wilkes Booth was an actor at Ford's Theater. That's why no one suspected him. He didn't really want to do this, but he really was in love with this girl whose parents, specifically her father and her brother, were massive Confederates. And the girl basically told him she'd marry him if he killed the president. I know, it's insane. But he kind of goes along with it. He thought about not doing it multiple times, but ends up going through with it anyways. But John Wilkes Booth is going to shoot Abraham Lincoln at close range in the back of the head in the presidential booth of Ford's Theater. He is going to then jump from the balcony, waving a knife in the air, and smash his leg when he lands on the stage. He's going to break it. He's going to supposedly yell "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which means "down with the tyrants." We don't know if that's 100% true, but that's what people say they heard. He's going to hobble out of Ford's Theater in the confusion, and he's going to somehow get away. Jumps on a horse and rides away. It's one of the most kind of ridiculous stories in U.S. history. Now, he'll eventually be caught in an old tobacco barn. The government, the soldiers will set the barn on fire, drag him out, and he'll be shot. So he will meet his end for all of this, but unfortunately, he'll kill Abraham Lincoln. They try to keep Lincoln alive for days. I mean, just clearing the blood clots and the hole out of the back of his head. I mean, because they got to figure out what to do. We have a president who's been killed here. Shot. What do we do with it? They don't know. But eventually Lincoln does pass away, and we're left with a couple of questions. How do we restore the Union? How do we get the North and the South to not necessarily agree, but somewhat come back together in this situation? And how do we integrate, some 4 million freed African Americans now? How do we put them into society? Where do they live? Where do they work? Do they get jobs? How does this happen? There's just a lot of questions that Lincoln, had to answer, but unfortunately is killed, and we don't get that chance, okay? So next unit, we're going to look at Reconstruction. We're going to look at Ulysses S. Grant, who will become president, and try and figure out how this happens. How do we put these things back together, okay? Hope everybody's doing all right. As usual, if you've got any questions, concerns, let me know, and I will do my best to help you out, okay? Keep your heads up.